Hello and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Jill Bodensteiner, Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University. As leaders, it's really important that we're clear regarding our goals and our vision and how those integrate into the greater university goals. We also need to collectively create a strategy and a culture that are going to help us reach our goals. This is an evolving exercise that requires an openness to continuous improvement. That's why I follow the One Question Leadership Podcast, because I love learning as much as I possibly can from my colleagues that helps me be the best that I can be. So my message for the day, keep learning, keep leading.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Dr. Nicki Moore. Nicki is the Vice President and Director of Athletics at Colgate. Greetings, Nicki. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Ty. It's good to be with you.
Now, you've been at Colgate for a little over 2 years. You spent, I think, 3 years at North Carolina. You were at Oklahoma for around 11 years. And in total, I guess, with some of your studies and postgraduate work, roughly 16 years in college athletics. Of course, worked with Joe Castiglione at Oklahoma, Bubba Cunningham at North Carolina. You have your PhD in counseling psychology. Worked with Joe to start the first psychological resources department fully housed within athletics while at Oklahoma. And you also have a background in academic advising and student athlete support. So I am happy to have you on, and you have a wealth of information. You have a coaching tree of your own, I think, in terms of people going into leadership positions and like executive leadership positions. So I definitely wanted to have you on the podcast. So I'm happy you're here.
Well, thanks so much. I've been looking forward to it.
Let's start with psychology. You started your career studying, working, I guess, starting that kind of department with sports psychology. You studied that as a student athlete at Missouri. You think you did some internships and graduate assistantship type situations in terms of working with the athletics department there when Joe was at Missouri. But I wonder what led you in the direction of sports psychology, and were you thinking about being an athletic director when you decided to go that route?
Yeah, I wasn't. I think it's funny, looking back on my career, it would seem as though I was being really intentional about my career plotting, but I actually had a lot of career ambivalence, didn't know what to do as an undergrad, ended up being an education major. And my coach, Dr. Rick McGuire, was my track and field coach, and he had his PhD in sports psychology. I had some pretty significant experiences with injury as I was a student athlete, and was also really interested in kind of like leadership and organizations. And I was a captain, and so I sort of liked the influencing, side of things, and interested in human performance, what helped people be their best when it counted. And so, I had the chance to pursue a master's in counseling psych and then a PhD in counseling psych, and just had wonderful mentors such as Joe, such as Rick McGuire, who, either saw something in me or just were helpful people to put me in positions to develop some skills that eventually ended up culminating in, being more in a place of readiness to do what I'm doing now. But it was about, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago before I was really thinking about being an AD.
That's interesting. After all those other years doing all the things in and around college athletics, that AD just popped up 3 or 4 years ago. Huh? That's very interesting.
Well, I thought about it, but I remember this moment really distinctly. It was in 2008. I remember because I was pregnant, and Joe had suggested that I go to the D1, at the time, the D1A Institute. Down in Dallas with Dutch Bachman. And I remember sitting on the front row. I'm a front row sitter. I raised my hand and asked questions. I just always have been. And I remember sitting in the room and the speakers, mostly sitting ADs, kept coming to the front of the room and saying, I know that all y'all want to be ADs, I'm like, no, I don't. I'm like not thinking about being an AD. Maybe
Right.
I'm in the wrong place. This is probably, I've wasted someone else's opportunity. But at some point along the line, it occurred to me, if I keep preparing to be an AD, and if I keep just saying yes to experiences and following my interests, and when Joe in particular kept sort of giving me new opportunities or offering opportunities to do new things, I just kept saying yes. And at some point it's like, well, if I keep doing these things, then if I want to be an AD someday, great, but at the time I wasn't driven toward that goal specifically.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I know Joe and I know Dutch. And if they were putting you in positions like the Institute, they were nudging you on purpose with intent to say, okay, you may not want to be, but this is going to happen. We're moving you in this direction.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Very fortunate to have those gentlemen in my life.
So you talk about working with elephants. We talked about Joe. You said Coach McGuire. We talked about Bubba Cunningham in North Carolina. These are elephants in the collegiate athletics industry in terms of leadership, in terms of developing other leaders. Your philosophy on leadership, probably comes from your time as a student athlete, your parents, from being around other leaders, right? These very influential people in each one of our lives. But I wonder, in terms of, you've been an AD for a little over 2 years now. Leadership can seem like 2 years can seem like a long time as a leader, but it also can seem like it hasn't been any time at all. So I wonder about your thoughts on your philosophy on leadership in the last just over 2 years there as an AD at Colgate.
Yeah, I have been surrounded by really great people, certainly Joe, certainly Bubba, who, just kept encouraging me along this path. And I don't know how much my philosophy has changed. It's being tweaked all the time, but I think it's really centered around the vision that we developed within about, 3 or 4 months, 4 or 5 months of me coming here to Colgate. I did a ton of interviewed everybody in the department when I got here, and talked to people outside of the department, just trying to get a sense of, what are the strengths of this particular place, and developed a vision of to be an inclusive community of competitive excellence. And when I look back on sort of my life and all that, it also comes, I did my PhD dissertation on developing a vital learning community, on Boyer's principles of a vital learning community. And those things are woven into that vision that we have for our department. In the first week that I was here, and I spent some time in front of my staff for the first time. And the night before, I remember thinking, what if I'm the staff, what do I need to hear from me? And we just had gone through a coaching transition too, within my first week. And it was like, okay, they need to know what my expectations are. And my expectations, as I communicated to them, was to love and listen and lead. And I could talk for a long time about those 3 expectations. Those have remained pretty consistent over the last 2 years and have gotten woven in different ways. So my meeting structures change from time to time. Some of the specific ways that those elements get woven into our actions, shift. But I think the underlying philosophy is pretty simple, in that I really believe that when I and my leadership team can inspire the very best in everybody that comes to us, and we can recruit a diverse and committed group of people to be here and be on this team, and then let them flourish and facilitate their brilliance where we are, and then we stay focused on a common goal and really aim to win and get better every day. And that's how we've defined competitive excellence, that we're going to be great. And so that underlying philosophy hasn't changed all that much, I would say.
You say you love and treat the people well with respect, right? Yes. How you would want to be treated. You listen to what people tell you, either audibly, visually, or by their actions. And you lead, or as you mentioned, facilitate in terms of helping them be great. I think that's excellent in terms of a leadership philosophy. And I can imagine it probably developed through the years, but when you're actually the person where the final decisions are made, those three things have probably come in handy.
Totally. Well, it goes back to the, like, how are you trying to help other people be their best? Because you're going to be your best when everyone else is bringing their best. And how do you remove barriers to their greatness and again, help them just to be great? We define leadership at Colgate, in Colgate Athletics anyway, as kind of looking around you and finding something that you can make better and then taking someone else with you to go make it better. Like, that's leadership. And everybody from the first year student assistant to the 30-year veteran has the opportunity to do that version of leadership,
which is excellent. I recently had Juliana Smith on.
Yeah.
She, your deputy AD, and she talks about working for you, how you listen to feedback, you'll ask questions. If she has to make her own decision, you guys have developed the trust for her to make those decisions.
Totally.
If she has to sit down and explain to you the decision, you will ask a number of questions to understand her logic. And if it makes sense, go on ahead and make it happen. I respect that about leadership as opposed to someone being a dictator, I guess. But I wonder about that aspect of it in terms of empowering people to have the influence and the authority to do the jobs they were hired to do. Is that something you've seen in a number of places you've been in terms of leadership?
Yeah, I think that I have seen that when I have been, working with the leadership of both Joe and Bubba, when they've given me that freedom to explore and to create and to take risks, that's when I've been my best. And so I certainly try to do that with our staff. But the other thing is that I also trust that they really believe that they often, particularly when it's in their areas of expertise, they often know better and have better perspective than I do, or additional. And certainly when we put our perspectives together, that we can come up with something better. So. But I, and also you just can't, I don't know how people that micromanage do it, to be honest. There's just not enough bandwidth.
It takes a lot of energy, doesn't it?
Yeah. So,
right. So, you mentioned, and I think you said this is the kind of purpose that you established for the department. Beyond the higher purpose, enhancing the academic mission of the university, your established purpose for the department was, or is, I guess, creating an inclusive community focused on competitive excellence. I may have said that wrong, but
very close. You're good.
You've shown and have not shied away from an opinion that very voices in the room, at the table, in leadership are important in terms of success for an organization and for society as a whole. Tell me why diversity, inclusion, equality is important to you. And have you seen examples of diversity helping an organization to be more effective?
Yes. Diversity helps us to be more effective every day. In terms of, I don't have all the answers, and don't even pretend to have a fraction of the perspectives that we might need to develop the very best kind of responses and plans to get better. And so those diverse voices are really critical to our success. Ultimately, for me, it's also about principle. And I really believe, I remember there are, of course, all sorts of things that are a little bit problematic with the Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In book. But one of the phrases that really stuck with me was, we're all better off in a more equal world. And throughout my experiences, I have found that the systems that oppress anyone hurt not only the oppressed, but the oppressor. But left unchecked and left to their own devices, that those systems will be perpetuated. And I recognize that I operate from a position of great privilege, from a race perspective, from an education standpoint, for all sorts of ways. I operate from a privileged perspective, and so I just really, believe that part of my purpose is facilitate the path for others where I can question things that maybe they can't. So I think it's just an important part of the work. Obviously, it's important for the student athletes and the coaches that we serve as well. And this in some ways comes from psychology, in that, you can be working with an individual, but if there's a way that you can impact the environment around, it's actually an ethical principle of psychologists that, if you can impact the environment that is negatively impacting the client, that's something you have to keep in mind and do. And so I think all of those things, lead to, I guess, my commitment to diversity. And then there's also this super selfish part of it, which is I want to be successful. I want our division to be successful. And we have to have those diverse voices in increasing numbers and increasing freedom to be able to really be our best.
And be able to do that. You've shown that through the people you've hired. I wonder, you said something there, I don't know if I can paraphrase it right, but a system of oppression, that oppression will reverberate, right? Will recreate itself. And I wonder if that's kind of psychological, where people may or may not even know what they are doing because they have existed in that environment their whole life or their whole career or something. And so that is their blueprint of how to move forward.
Yeah.
I wonder about that.
Yep. Well, it's, humans like stasis, homeostasis. We tend to, humans tend to not like change all that much. It sort of throws you off. And particularly when systems are built to keep certain groups in positions of power, those who are operating from those positions may not know that. Like they may not be consciously aware that we live in a patriarchal, cisgendered, white supremacist system, able-bodied, et cetera. They may not recognize that, but we are. And so by, not addressing it, not challenging it, in allowing ourselves to be in a state of lack of awareness, we're essentially become pawns of that oppression, where we also are being used to continue that oppression. So anyway, I think that it's like once you become aware of it, I hope people decide to choose to press against it, because it's clearly a system that does not facilitate the most opportunity for everyone that's in it.
Interesting, just popped in my mind, is that the opposite end of the spectrum, when you are running an organization that is about empowering, no matter who they are, if they're capable or if they have the potential, and you help them go out and become who they need to become, and it isn't oppressive, saying a Joe Castiglione, right? Then people go out and they do the same thing. They recreate leadership. They recreate environments where people can be successful. I mean, this is whiteboarding, right? It's not always, it's new. Life is nuanced. So it's not always the same, but it's interesting, right? It's interesting that both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, right. Well, without questioning it, we tend to parent the way we parent. We tend to do relationships the way we do relationships. We tend to coach the way we were coached, unless we actively engage and try to figure out how to do it better. And we have to disrupt those sort of systems or patterns, because humans do tend to want to be in patterns. And it's interesting because it kind of relates back to one of the approaches that I used regularly as a psychologist, which is an interpersonal approach to therapy, where one of the underlying foundational kind of beliefs there is that people will recreate this similar relational patterns across relationships in their life. And so in all likelihood, the relationship that they present to you and create with you as a therapist is going to have some similarities to other relationships. And then you can use that relationship that you've built with them to help them learn new patterns, in more sort of healthier or more effective patterns for them at that stage in their life. So yeah, it all kind of connects, I guess.
I have a bigger question, but I want to ask a smaller question before I get to the bigger question. In your communications daily or relationships, do you lead with that subconsciously, understanding the relationship, like, is that a part of who you are, the psychological aspect? And then the bigger question is, in terms of your career, leadership, hiring, leading people, and making and evaluating decisions, how does psychology play into that?
Yeah, I think that it sort of like, you'll sometimes hear people talk about when they go to law school or when you're going to business school, but I hear it a lot when people talk about going to law school, they learn how to think in a certain way. And I think that I don't know that I can outrun that part of my training. Essentially, it was about 10 years of intensive training and supervision and teaching. So I do think in some ways it probably changed how I think. And so while it's not necessarily an active part of the way I'm conceptualizing relationships in my professional life, I am certain that it shapes my interactions. And just like it probably shapes the way I parent when I'm trying to parent intentionally and, those
Right.
sorts of things. So, but as it relates to my career, certainly like with hiring, it definitely shows up. Not so much in like, I think people always worry a little bit that you're analyzing them, or, so there's this assumption that you're kind of like, have this evil background, metacognition thing going on.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. But, we are really intentional with our hiring of identifying, we've identified 5 virtues that, as opposed to values, because we want them to be very lived values. So, we, as opposed to humility, as opposed to like teamwork, our word is cohesive. So it's thoughtful, driven, enthusiastic, cohesive, and bold. And so when we're hiring, we've actually operationalized those virtues. So for example, cohesive is team over self, no excessive ego, define success collectively. So we're looking for those specific things to come out, or we're asking specific questions to try to get a sense of, what's someone's position or how do they think of themselves or see themselves in the world relative to that virtue. So we've got those 5 things, and then we've of course, depending upon the job description and some of those kinds of things, it gets, it varies from search to search. But so I do think that it kind of weaves its way in there, that particular training.
Right. Interview towards those things which are your values, which is very interesting. Well, Nicki, this has been an excellent conversation. Love, listen, and lead, I think, are 3 great ways to approach leadership. And I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership podcast.
Well, you bet. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and I hope that there was something of value in there. So, but thanks again, Ty, for the time. I appreciate it.
That was Dr. Nicki Moore. She is the Vice President and Director of Athletics at Colgate. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.